In early June of this year, I was riding my four-wheeler above Jasper, Colorado, at about 7 in the morning. I had stopped to rest at the logging block when I heard a loud howling noise. There was no wind that day, and I could not focus in on the source. I had seen a lot of sheep on Cornwall Mountain, all the way up, so I figured it was a dog or the sheep herder. When I had finished my water, I was loading everything back on the bike, when I heard the same sound again, only this time it was much louder. I zeroed in on it, and my heart stopped. Slightly below my logging road, and to my right, I observed a very large, dirty black man-like creature with its hands around an aspen tree. It was leaning a little to the right, staring at me. I stood very still and never took my eyes off of it. After about 7 or 8 minutes, it turned and simply walked off down the hill. I will add that I am a 30-year archery hunter and have successfully tagged bears in the same unit. This was no bear. It was large and very shaggy looking. I was camping with my family at the headwaters of Clear Creek Reservoir near Granite, Colorado. I was very young at the time. I was with 8 of my cousins, and we decided to climb the hill at the north end of the reservoir to get a better view of the area. There were 9 of us ranging in age from 9 to 14 years old. When we reached the top of the hill, we started rolling rocks down the hill. It was then that we noticed, right across the ravine from where we stood, a tremendous amount of crashing through the aspens. At first, we thought it was a grizzly bear, since it stood on its hind legs watching us from a distance of about 300 feet. Its hair was golden brown in color, and very long. It was very tall. I'd say at least 8 feet. It just stood there on 2 legs, looking straight at us. I could not see its face. The sun was at its back, and its face was in silhouette. But I could tell that the face was very dark. The head and body were large and were not built like a bear. We stood and watched this animal, and it watched us for several minutes. It stood on 2 legs, and at all times it seemed to rock back and forth. At the time, I assumed that this was because it wanted to get our scent, or maybe get a better view. We then decided to run for it. We came down the hill at breakneck speed, and were scolded by our parents, who thought we could have broken a leg running so fast down the hill. My parents claimed it was a bear, but I've been hunting and fishing these mountains for 30 years. I have never seen a grizzly bear in this part of the state. I have seen grizzly bears before, and their fur is brown. The color of the fur on this animal was unlike anything I have ever seen. Again, it was very long and golden in color. To this day, me and my cousins swear we saw a Bigfoot. A friend and I and my dog were hiking in the Loveland Pass of Colorado. We parked on Highway 6 where it crosses the Continental Divide and hiked south along the divide for about 5 miles. We meandered down into one of the valleys carved into the divide on the eastern side. We were looking for pioneer artifacts from the many who passed through this area on the trek to California. We had descended below the tree line where the valley peters out into a boggy meadow. This meadow runs down to a stream to the immediate east. The stream is large at this point, and I think this is the same stream that can be seen from Interstate 70 at the Eisenhower Tunnel several miles north at the Loveland Ski Resort. Dense brush and tree cover run along the opposite bank. We began to hear what we thought were noises from a large animal across the stream. We tried approaching the source of the noise, but as we moved closer, the sound moved away downstream along the opposite bank. I started catching glimpses of a large, hairy brown and black animal and thought we were following a bear. My friend had the same idea, and our pace slowed to a halt. The animal then moved a little closer to us and appeared to watch us for several seconds. Its height made it look like a bear reared up on its hind legs. It then turned and moved off downstream through the brush in a long, loping, 2-legged gait that would have been impossible for a bear. We did not care to follow. Adding to my belief that what we saw was not a bear, or other wild animal is the fact that my dog did not bark or show any of the aggressive excitement he usually displays upon encountering a wild animal. He actually drove an adult black bear, which was pillaging garbage cans, out of a campground several years ago. During our encounter in Loveland, he only showed the polite interest he shows in people in the woods. It was Friday, January 25th, 2001. At first, I was not even going to go down to the area where I and a friend saw a Bigfoot. I was going to finish watching the Pagosa basketball team play and go home. But a boxing match was on the same night, and my best friend's, not the friend that saw it with me, brother-in-law was going to buy it on pay-per-view, and his brother-in-law lives in the area of Chromo and Edith in Colorado. There are always some crazy sightings of UFOs and Bigfoots, but I really didn't believe in these types of things until I saw one for myself. We watched the boxing match, and after it was over, we started to head back to Pagosa Springs on Chromo Road, and we were almost to Highway 84 when about 20 yards in front of us, this thing or Bigfoot crossed and went quickly, almost as if we were seeing things. I didn't know what to think, so I asked Sammy if he saw it, and he said, "What was that?" We didn't know what to think. We weren't sure. We got up to where it crossed, and I opened my door to look down on the road and saw a footprint, and Sammy opened his door and saw a track too. We both freaked out, and I drove as fast as I could. We didn't tell that many people, only the ones that would believe us. On December 20th, 2000, my wife and daughter were walking along a road when they spotted two large footprints in the snow, about 5 feet off the road, a quarter mile away from our cabin. Due to the size of the prints, at first they thought it was a bear, but as they got closer, they saw it was this huge footprint, and it was very similar to a man's without shoes on. They came home insisting I come and look at this thing. I examined the print by placing my foot next to it. My shoe size is 10.5, and this print was 5 inches longer and double the width. I estimated it was 14 inches long with toes, and a slight curve in the arch area. It was left a mystery until today's Denver Post arrived with an article on Bigfoot displaying the same footprint we examined on that day in December. There's a lot of things that come out of the desert that I don't quite understand, even if it's the situations that I myself was put in. I'm half Navajo and know all about skinwalkers and the legends that part of my people have passed down for years and years. Because I am half Navajo, I have always had a lot of friends and family that were richly immersed in the Navajo culture and lifestyle, while a lot of my other family and friends were just regular people. I consider myself extremely blessed to be able to experience both walks of life and cultures. I have even had encounters with such beings before, but that is for another time and place. What I'm talking to you about today is something that is far beyond my understanding, and something my people never talked about to my knowledge. I was out late at night once, past the reservation on my way back. I had just gotten done partying with a couple of friends, and we were doing a late night drive. I should note at this time that nobody in the vehicle, including the driver, was intoxicated or not sober in any way. This also includes me. We were just really needing some fresh air and to get out, and there's nothing like Arizona nighttime air. We're driving down the road, and we're the only ones that we could see around us. If anybody has ever driven out here at night, you would know that it is pitch black, except for the stars above you, that only offer little light, and the moon occasionally. My buddy was doing about 70 or 75 miles an hour, when out of the darkness, over a ridge to our left, flying towards our vehicle, was this large lizard-like creature. It was running on all fours, but it looked strange, like it was forced. It would be like making a human run on all fours. It was awkward looking, and you can tell that they don't normally or didn't normally run like that. This thing had protruding spines and scales all over its back, and little horns to be what was aligned on its shoulder blade all the way down to its buttocks, and it was scaly, and it was almost a smoky charcoal color. It nearly collided with our car as it got close. It outstretched its arm and slashed at the left front tire, causing it to go flat immediately, and we almost nearly crashed off the road. All of us in the car are screaming bloody murder and going crazy, while my friend is trying to stabilize the car and floor it at the same time on a flat tire. The impact of this thing slashing the tire did so much damage to the car that it nearly took us off the road. As my friend is trying to floor the car on a shredded tire and also regain stability of the vehicle, we hear this loud metal clashing sound from the engine. That meant his transmission went out. Now he was no longer able to accelerate, and he was forced to slowly glide and come down to a stop in the middle of the road at night. I think we all just sat there screaming our heads off, freaking out, not knowing what to do. My two friends in the back weren't Navajo at all. They were just regular high school kids that we had partied with. And after a minute, I think we were able to collect ourselves enough to have somebody trying to make a phone call to get somebody to come pick us up. The only person we knew, unfortunately, was my friend's father, and he was an abusive alcoholic. So he pulls out his phone and proceeds to call his father to come pick him up and let him know that our car broke down, purposefully not mentioning that we were just attacked and chased off the road by some large demon lizard thing. His dad says he will be there in about 20 minutes or shorter, and for us to sit tightly. My friend, who is a full-blooded Navajo, just starts praying in Navajo, while my other friends and I are freaking out still, expecting this thing to show itself and kill us all. It was incredibly eerie, sitting there waiting for his dad to show up, knowing that this thing was just a little ways away in the darkness, surrounding us, waiting for the right moment to get us. At least that's how it felt. But nothing happened. We just sat there in the car, alone, with the night around us, silent, expecting something to happen. That's when we saw headlights show up over the horizon. After some time, and lo and behold, it was his father to come save us. Like I said earlier, I was never a huge fan of his father personally, because he was an abusive alcoholic, but that was probably the one and only time I'd ever been happy to see him. We all piled in the car without him even getting a chance to see the car and the condition that it was in. And even though we never said anything about what we saw, I knew that we couldn't be happier to be rescued. For whatever reason, whatever it was we saw never tried to attack us more than once, and once our car was on the side of the road, it seemed like it just left us alone. I'm not exactly sure why. Could it possibly because my friend was praying in Navajo? I don't know. But I think the bigger question remains is what exactly did we see, and why did it attack our vehicle? This thing was huge, and must have had an immense force to use its claws to slash a tire open with one strike. When his dad pulled up, since it was dark out, we really didn't give him a chance to see what happened and only told him. It wasn't until the following morning we all came back to retrieve the car and get it towed that his father saw the damage to the tire for the first time. I remember his expression and him kneeling down to look at the huge gash to the tire and sternly looking at my friend saying, "Son, what really happened here?" You can tell he was concerned and knew something had happened. And no, it wasn't that we drove over a broken bottle. He knew. That's when my friend finally told him what had happened, quietly. His father had hugged him, something I hadn't seen him do in the entire amount of years that I had known them, and spoke something to him quietly in his ear, in Navajo that I couldn't quite make out. Apparently, not only had his transmission gone out randomly, but we had been attacked by something none of us even knew existed. At least with skinwalkers, they're in our culture. We know about them. We know ways to protect ourselves from them and to stay away. There is no preparing any of us for this creature. I'm not sure if it was a creature of the desert or a creature of the night, but either way, it's just another nightmare to try and avoid now. Maybe many of the older Navajo around here don't speak of other such things because it's true that if you speak about it, it will draw them to you. Could this be true for what we encountered? Or were we simply marked and attacked by something more sinister and evil? Let me begin this with a brief bit of information about the area. The South San Juan Wilderness in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado is considered to be Colorado's wildest corner. It was in the backcountry of this wilderness in the fall of either 1977 or 1979, I forget which, that a Sioux grizzly bear was startled and attacked a bow hunter. He was mauled but managed to kill the bear with an arrow he repeatedly drove into the bear's chest. It was thought that the grizzly had long been extirpated from all of Colorado. If there are grizzlies still in Colorado, this is where they are thought to be. I have been hiking, backpacking, camping, and fly fishing in this area for about 6 years now, making about 2 to 3 trips per spring, summer, fall, and one of those trips usually includes a backpack into the backcountry. I am very familiar with the sounds and the various animals that make in this forest and mountains of the West and of this specific area. On this last trip, I managed to sneak away for a 3-day weekend in mid-June with the new lab. I heard that salmon fly hatch had started and wanted to try and get a piece of the action, fly fishing for big, aggressive trout. I figured I would save myself a few dollars by not camping in the developed Forest Service campsites and enjoy some solitude at the same time. So I camped in large series of meadows known as the Trail Creek Primitive Camping Area. No water, no services, just camp where you will. I was about 15 miles from the tiny community of Platoro at the upper end of the Conejes Valley, and maybe 10 to 15 miles from the next nearest community of assorted vacation houses, known as the Rocky Mountain Estates back down the valley. I did not realize it at the time, but this was a remote area, even though the dirt road that ran up and down the valley was only about a half a mile across the meadows from my camping spot. Behind me, by about 50 yards, was the edge of a 150-foot moderate canyon of the upper section of the Pinnacles run of the river. On the other side of the canyon, which is steep but easily crossed by humans, is a huge expansive mountainside of aspen groves, spruce and fir trees, and mountain meadows. This is the beginning edge of the South San Juan Wilderness area. The second evening I had cooked dinner and taken the lab out for the last evening walk around the meadows. It had been a good day of fishing, and we were both tired. We went to bed in the tent just at dark. It was a night of an almost full moon, and we both fell asleep quickly. A bit later, I awoke and thought I had heard something outside the tent, probably a deer. But because I was curious, I sat awake for a bit and listened. After about 10 minutes from out of nowhere, I heard this unreal, loud, clear, resonant scream, screech, howl, roar type sound from not too far away. It sounded maybe 400 yards away, and like it might have been just across the canyon on the mountainside. It was like no sound I have ever heard in my life. It was fairly high-pitched and did not have the rough, gravelly sound that cats have when they roar and call. It was clear, crisp, loud, and lasted for 6 seconds. It seemed to be 2 parts screaming howl and 1 part roar, as it had that deep quality, but it was still high-pitched. I sat there for a minute, stunned, and then realized what it must be. I have read accounts on several websites before of the sounds these creatures supposedly make, and this was what my mind came to. So I guess chance does favor that prepared my mind. It was not that far away. The sound seemed to be coming directly toward me, like it might have been screaming at or towards me or this meadow area where people sometimes camp. It felt territorial, aggressive, even a little threatening. Even though I had a .357 loaded with hot, hollow points and a strong flashlight, the prospect of encountering some big, hairy man thing outside my tent in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere and alone, was a little more than I wanted to deal with. I got the dog in the truck and got the hell out of there, with a .357 in my lap. After a few minutes on the way back down the valley, toward an area where I could sleep in peace, I sort of had delayed reactions. I became unnerved and thought if I actually see one of these things in the headlights or on the side of the road next to my truck as I passed it, I might really lose it. I was that rattled. I have lived and backpacked extensively in Montana and in the Canadian Rockies and dealt with the reality of grizzly bears with no real problem. But this noise and the creature that most likely made it really freaked me out. After sleeping in the car in the nearest little town of Antonio, I could not find any lodging at 11:30 at night. I went back a little after daybreak to look around and to get ready for another day of fishing. I ate a cautious breakfast and kept looking around, worried I might actually see one of these things. But in the daylight, I was not quite as unnerved. I did not find any tracks in the greater area in which I was camping. It was just mostly grass, although I did walk around and search for a bit. When I got home, I went online and listened to recordings of mountain lions and bobcats. Although I know these sounds and have actually seen a mountain lion up close in the wild, the sound was definitely not one of these. But when I went to this website and listened to some of the recordings, I realized it had to be one of these creatures. The sound was a bit higher in pitch than some of the other recordings, but very similar to most other respects. Now, I am paranoid and worried that I might not be doing any more backpacking in this beautiful and remote area for fear of running into one of these spooky creatures, especially at night.
Four or 5 years back, I went through an experience with something that I can't exactly explain. I know many people out there go through different things in life, but this one really stands out to me. There are so many that would have gone through what I've gone through with trauma and not being able to go back into the wilderness, but for me, it was more of a wake-up call to the open-minded and to be alert to all things that we don't know about. I had no idea this would happen to me, and I ventured into this place not knowing exactly what I would get myself into. Back in the late summer, I would usually go and hike and venture around in the swamps and Everglades of Florida, all the way up into the swamps and bayous of Louisiana. There's just something about the thick, swampy humidity that just draws me in. I absolutely love the wildlife and the thrill and rush of being around so many dangerous and poisonous animals. I know many might call me crazy by saying that, but it puts you on edge and makes you have an alertness to things and noises around you that you wouldn't normally have. I've camped alone by myself in the Everglades and all through the swamp for years, for weeks at a time. I feel like it's only made me a hardier individual. Doing what I do isn't for everybody, and it certainly is an incredibly hard feat at times. The scorching heat and high levels of humidity are enough to make many novice to moderate explorers tap out. That also doesn't include things like water moccasins, poisonous insects and snakes, alligators, and terrain so thick you can hardly get through. I think that's why it draws me in so much, because it presents itself as such a challenge that I want to conquer. Anyway, I don't want to bore you with irrelevant details. I just want listeners to know that many don't go out trotting through this type of environment for long. I feel like that's the only reason I experienced what I did, is because I put myself in that environment for the time that I did. Had I only gone for a day or two, I don't believe I would be walking away the same person. I want to say this happened in August of 2014 or possibly 2015. I was deep in the swamps somewhere right around the border of Louisiana, and I can't exactly remember the spot, but I was in there deep. There were certainly parts of the swamp that I traversed through that were so thick you needed a very sharp machete or some sort of thick cutting tool to even make your way in or around. The first major component that I had encountered was what I believed to be a den or a hole or possibly a tunnel that these things lived in. After coming to an area in which it was clear man had not ventured into because of the density of brush and thickness, swamp-like conditions, I had to work to pave my way in. I put myself in harm's way in the name of exploration, venturing into unknown dangerous waters with reptiles that could easily take me out. It's not like I wasn't vulnerable at all. Many would call me foolish for doing such things, but like I said earlier, there's just something about the thrill of it. I lost track of how much time I put into cutting my way through the thick overgrowth of swamp, but came to a small patch of land that looked to be beveled out in the ground with what appeared to be a finely dug hole. This looked to be like a well-constructed entrance to a cave or something, but you could tell it wasn't naturally occurring. The problem is, this hole was around 7 feet tall, if I had to guess, but was more narrow. I know for a fact it was taller than me, because I'm 5'11". There is no known animals in the swamp that would make this hole this way, nor any animals that come close to the size. This got me very intrigued, but I wasn't about to go stick myself in a dugout entrance to a cave without any light or proper equipment. The swamps is one thing, but that's venturing into spelunking, into a potential den of a dangerous animal. Boy, was I proven right. After being fascinated and spending a small time observing the entrance, curious as to what would create it, I started getting this feeling. I really started to get the feeling that I shouldn't be there. It's as if my senses were screaming at me that a large predator would be coming out or possibly approaching. I'm no stranger to those feelings, having encountered multiple mountain lions and even mama bears with cubs in the past. I wasn't about to blow off my gut instinct. It's something I respect and always listen to. I quickly continued on and thought nothing of it. Made it about another half day to a spot in even denser wilderness that I was able to set up and make a tiny camp. Tiny camp being my one-person tent and a small cot. The nighttime is where things get really out of hand, and the following day, I was able to make a camp spot in a little cutaway spot in the brush that suited well for where I'd sleep. It was already getting dusk, so I began sitting at my one-person tent, like I just said. I laid on my small cot with my small 9mm by my side. I always kept that thing with me, no matter where I go. Yeah, it might not do great in every situation, but some protection is better than nothing, and a bullet will serve me far better than a rusty old knife ever will. My thoughts at the time were focused on where I was going to the following day, and what part of the swamp I would want to make my way through. I must have been in intensive thought, because at some point or another, I had fallen asleep, totally unaware of my exhaustion of the day. I had totally forgotten all about finding that hole earlier, and feeling the sensation of doom following it. I'm not exactly sure if my senses woke me up or what happened, but my consciousness flicked on with my eyes still closed. You know how it is. I quickly was alerted to something heavy and large approaching my tent from in the brush. It was slow at first, but it became heavier the closer it came to my tent. My mind was racing to come up with an answer on what this could be. Approaching from the thick, swampy brush, I didn't feel fear as I was perplexed on what exactly I was hearing. That's when I was able to make out that what I was hearing was something bipedal and not on 4 feet like an animal or a bear. Whatever I was hearing was creeping up to my tent and intentionally trying to be quiet and sneaky from the brush with 2 footsteps for each stride. I thought it to be a person coming to rob me at first, and my thoughts quickly turned to fear as I realized that no human was heavy enough to create footsteps that loudly. Whatever this was came in on my tent fast, and before I could even think, I could feel the presence of somebody or something right outside my tent. The air around me quickly grew incredibly tense. I quickly reached for my handgun, which I keep loaded at any given moment. As I'm reaching for my weapon, I see this claw, or what I believe to be a claw, begin to press itself so hard into the tent wall, it ripped right through. Bursting through my tent wall was a large black-like claw. My mind immediately went to the velociraptors in the Jurassic Park movies. Those big black raptor claws. That's exactly what it looks like. But I didn't think about that in the moment. I grab a hold of my gun and steadily flip the safety off. As I'm turning my arm towards this unknown intruder, this claw begins to shred all the way down and my tent into pieces, just dragging all the way down the wall, leaving a gaping hole. Before I could finish pulling the claw out, I fired one good shot, and the scream that I heard after, it was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. This thing wasn't a human, and it certainly wasn't any animal I'd ever come to know. I can't even begin to tell you or describe to you the sound of what this scream sounded like. It was horrible Whatever it was took off in the opposite direction, crashing through the brush rather quickly. It must have been really large, because the crashing sound was immense and powerful. It had fled even faster than when it had descended upon my tent the first time. It had torn such a long hole through my tent wall that I was literally able to jump out of my cot and step outside of my tent for the first time to chase my assailant, but it was far too dark to see anything. I think in the moment I was just so pumped full of adrenaline that I wasn't even taking into consideration what it was that even did try to come into my tent, because I feel most sane human beings wouldn't be chasing after whatever the hell this thing was with a 9mm pistol. I don't think I was standing outside trying to let my eyes adjust to the darkness for more than a moment, trying to listen, when I started hearing more and more thudding coming in my direction. I was able to make out in just seconds that thudding were more heavy footsteps. I jumped back in my tent, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it in the general direction that I heard the thudding. Same direction that the first one came in. I'm assuming whatever it was that I shot, or whoever it was coming back, and I was going to end it for good. I'm not a murderer by any means, but if it's a matter of me or you, well, sorry. I wasn't going to die out here all alone in the swamp. I'd shown my light, and the first thing I saw were these deep red, reptilian-looking eyes, followed by a body crashing through the brush, heading right for me. Now, I realized a couple things in that moment. Not only did I have full view of whatever the hell I was looking at, but I realized for the first time that there's more to this world than we could ever come to realize, whether we enjoy it or not. I don't think my brain really took more than a couple of seconds to process what it was I was looking at, because I don't think I really ever fully processed it. I just started firing round after round like a madman into whatever this thing that was approaching me. Let me give you some more details real quick. This thing was taller than me, so probably 7 to 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark, gangly looking green scales with some lighter scales on the front of its body. This thing was walking bipedally and had a large reptilian looking head. It actually to me looked very crocodilian, with large teeth protruding at its top and bottom jaws and deep red reptilian eyes. It almost looked to me like you combined a person with a crocodile and maybe iguana. I don't mean like those glowing fake red eyes though that you hear in monster stories. These were just natural reptilian eyes, but they were a deep crimson. This was obviously some sort of humanoid reptilian being that I must have pissed off somehow, because it looked mad, and it was coming right for me. After firing off a couple of shots, it disappeared into the dark. I realized then that there were more than just one, and I jumped back into my tent with my gun clasped tightly, ready for war. I was so pumped full of adrenaline, I don't think I was really comprehending exactly what was going on, and that I needed to survive, and that I was being attacked by some large swamp animal. The swamp stayed dead silent around me, and I heard no more sounds for the next few hours as I stayed up, awake and alert, and ready for anything. Day started to break at some point, and I think I caught myself nodding off out of sheer exhaustion and being pumped so full of adrenaline the night before. I didn't have a watch or any way to tell time on me, so I'm not exactly sure what time in the morning that little encounter happened. All I know is daylight came and I got my stuff together, my now tattered tent, useless, and my cot, and I tried to get out of there as quick as I could. And don't worry, I kept my pistol at the ready. I decided to keep going in the direction I was originally planning, and that would take me out of the thicket of the swamp. I don't think it was more than an hour later that I encountered another clear area in the swamp with yet another large hole like I found the day before. It looked exactly the same with the same artificial looking entrance that looked dug out. What was even more disturbing is all around the hole with soft mud were these incredibly large reptilian footprints of something that looked bipedal, at least the way it walked did. These were massive prints, far bigger than my hand, and the indent was at least an inch deep. Of course, I had nothing to cast these footprints with, nor take a picture with, but for the first time this whole trip, I actually felt spooked because what I dealt with last night was a reality. And in that moment, I pieced it together that whatever it was I had encountered last night must have been whatever was traveling or living in these tunnels. some sort of large swamp reptilian beings. This hole had a smell too. It was a mixture of death, blood, and swamp rot. I didn't spend any time hanging around other than to look at the tracks and traverse out of there, and I tried to make my way further away from this whole area that I regret now going into. It took me the rest of the day to get back to an area where there was at least some civilization, a lone road possibly, being able to hitchhike back to real civilization. I didn't really tell anybody what happened to me or my story because I didn't really think it would be appropriate. What happens in the swamp stays in the swamp, and I just figured that I had encountered some sort of creature that had been undiscovered in the swamp and had been left alone by man, forgotten in the thick Everglades. What I didn't know is that there is such thing as reptilian beings, these 8 to 9 foot tall bipedal reptilian carnivores. My speculation is that maybe the first time I had encountered one of their tunnels, they were in an area or could smell me and didn't like that I had discovered their hole, which is the reason why they followed me and tracked me down to where I had bedded down at. As frightening as this whole experience was, I have never let it stop me from continually exploring and going back into the swamps to the areas where I love to go. I just have to accept there's more than meets the eye, and I need to be aware of my surroundings to every degree. The area of swamp that I traversed into was thick and very hard to get into. As I was cutting my way into the thick brush, I could see why many, if none at all, had not traveled into it. This was miles and miles in, traversing through thick brush and questionable bogs and areas of water where there could have been alligators and such. I don't think the way anybody would go so far back, which was why I was brave enough to do it, even if it meant putting myself in danger and being extremely vulnerable. It makes sense now from an animal's perspective why they would have some sort of den back there, without the worry or fear of being disturbed by humans. But at the same time, I set myself up for being way too vulnerable. For anybody out there who's an avid explorer like me and goes to the areas where nobody else goes, you need to be aware that there might be things that you don't like that live out there, and that you might be encroaching on the territory. This is why it's important to have respect for the wilderness and the things around you, and it is vital, but take caution and take heed. I would like to think that I share the swamp with every other being. Unfortunately, I don't share the swamp with friendly neighbors, so to speak, and that I guess there are some things that just wish to remain hidden.
I live in Denver, Colorado, and I may have seen a Bigfoot when I was in college in Boulder, Colorado, several years prior. This occurred in November of 1995. I was a freshman college student in Boulder, Colorado, and I used to like hiking in the Chautauqua Park nearby, which is higher than the rest of Boulder and faces the city. One night I was in Chautauqua Park at about 11 p.m. It was cold and I was standing in my coat, looking down at the city lights. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound and turned toward it. That's when I saw a large figure that was silhouetted against the city lights. It looked like a very large, hairy, naked person with a powerful build, broad shoulders, and a relatively small, pointed or bullet-shaped head. It spotted me, which made me afraid of being attacked, but instead it began running toward the cover of the trees. Its running gait was unlike that of any person I had seen. It was a kind of hunched-over, loping gait. Nevertheless, the figure moved quickly and disappeared behind a tree. That was all I saw of the figure. I have always considered this a possible Bigfoot sighting. This incident occurred after my husband, myself, and our 3 children and I had moved up to some land purchased on Sugarloaf Mountain, west of Boulder, Colorado. My husband managed a tavern at the time and had purchased the 5-acre silver mining claim for a song from At the Bar and on a paper napkin. I'm withholding the name of the song. We built a tiny 12 by 16 cabin and squeezed ourselves in there on the south side of the mountain, about 2/3 of the way along the original little mining road. The cabin was on only level land on a heavily treed and rocked parcel. The north side of the cabin snugged right up against the mountain slope, with pine trees all around. That side was 2 plywood sections high, which would have put it a hair over 16 foot. We had an oversized plywood platform bunk bed in the northeast corner of the cabin, which we adults and our baby daughter on the first level, and the 2 boys on the upper level. We put in a little window up there for them for air, and put in an inside shutter on it so they could close it when it got really cold, which it sometimes did. It reached 40 below the first winter we were there. I think it was during the second autumn there, so it would have been 1971. Our then 5.5-year-old son claimed he heard the sound of footsteps in the early evening after hearing a really strange sound. Definitely an animal, but he had no words at the time to even describe it or the age. He said it sounded like a call of some sort, and bigger than an owl. Some kind of hooting, I can guess. Then he heard some noises close by, rustlings or something. When he looked up through the open shutter window, he said he looked right into the face of a monster. All I know for sure is that I'll certainly never forget his terrified screams. When he calmed down, he described it as dark and very hairy, and a funny face and glowing eyes. It turned and ran away as soon as he started screaming. His brother, 2 years older, slept through the incident until his brother's shrieks woke us all up. With the ground sharply slanted up, we figured something would have had to have been just about 7 to 8 feet tall to peer into that upper window. Not being trained trackers, we found no evidence the next day. But our son, who is now almost 35, swears to this day that it was Bigfoot that he saw, and I have always believed him since there was no way in the world that, at his age, he could have made that a precise and auditory visual image of his terror. He came over and visited us this morning, told him about the article in the Post, and he reiterated his story. He says the image has never left him, and probably never will.
About 12 to 15 years ago, I used to do some missionary work for a church that I was a part of, in which I got to visit a lot of the world, and for that, I'm forever thankful. I learned a lot, and grew a lot as a person, but what's even more remarkable is some of the stories that I got to hear from some of these people in villages. This particular story that I'm going to share with you was from a man from one of the villages in Eastern Africa. Forgive me because I can't remember the country. His English, though, was actually pretty good for being a native and for how primitive he lived. He would tell me things about creatures of the night attacking their village and taking their young children down into the rivers and drowning them and eating them. He explained that these demons were crocodilian-looking creatures with long lizard-like heads and snouts, and sometimes eating the children whole before taking them back into the river. He went on to tell me that even river crocodiles and the hippopotamus would fear these humanoid beings, and that they would only enter into the village at nighttime. They had constructed several religious wards to try and rid these beings from entering, but they didn't work. More than a dozen of the village's children had been taken over the last several years. Warriors and men alike of the village had put together a little hunting party to travel into or close to the river as possible to seek these beings out, to hunt and to kill. They've been able to kill a couple, but more men have died from fighting these things than they've been able to kill, so there was a retreat. Some of these same men faced vicious repercussions of attacks, with severed arms and other miscellaneous chunks of flesh taken out of their body. These men look like they've been attacked by river crocodiles, but have actually only had fights with whatever these beings were. I was even told that sometimes when these beings come to abduct young children, that they will kill them right there on the spot and ripping them into pieces, biting off portions and limbs of their body. When I asked him to clarify more on what these lizard-like beings were, he told me that they were tall and scrawny with very long arms. Some were pale, some were darker, and some were almost black. They had these long claws at the end of their fingers and have huge, sharp dinosaur-like teeth. When I asked about their face, he explained that their snout was kind of sloped downward, and that the snout was extremely long, reminiscent to that of a caiman. Their eyes will glow a natural yellow, and they have an emanation of evil from them. You hardly ever see them on land, and they only come out of the water or the river at night. When they drag children away, it's to drown them into the river and pull them down to where they are. The man said and thought to be that the children were drowned and stuck underneath the bed at the bottom of the river, kind of like how a crocodile does once it death rolls its prey and stores its body in the soft silted mud underneath for later. But nobody knows for sure. So far, no one has been brave enough to try and swim down into the river to try and find them, or to know exactly where these things are coming from. Now, I need to clarify that personally, I never saw any of these beings or any of this myself, since this was just a village we were passing through for the day, shortly. But him and several other villagers I spoke to seemed downright terrified, and only verified even more with what he told me, the more and more I spoke to villagers. Mothers would be panicked at me just bringing the topic up, and would keep their children locked away inside and hidden, with men carrying crude weapons around them at all time, same with the women, which was actually shocking to see most mothers carrying around some sort of spear or dagger. I wish I could remember the word they used to call these things, but it basically meant crocodile people in their language, or so I was told. Honestly, that will always and forever stick with me, because it literally chilled me to the bone.
This incident happened with my mother, father, and uncle, four-wheeling on the Chromo Road in Colorado. We had made it past Lake Chromo and to the end of the Jeep Road, where we fished for a while and ate our lunch. When we left the last lake, it was about 1:30 p.m., with my uncle and me in the lead on our four-wheelers. We had gone about a half mile when my uncle and I spotted something that looked like a dead, burned tree stump that was about 7 to 8 feet tall. We didn't think too much of it until it moved. It stood upright and walked like a man. At first we thought it was a hiker, but it was all the same color, from head to toe. It walked about 15 yards before it walked into the trees. My uncle and I both stopped to make sure we saw the same thing, but we drove down the road about 300 to 400 yards before we decided to go look for it. We walked into the trees about 200 yards and came to a small meadow. My uncle was looking the other way when at the other end of the meadow it ran through. I yelled, "There it goes!" and we took off after it on foot. This time I got a little bit better chance to look at it. The creature was a light to a medium brown and had shaggy long hair. It stood about 7 feet tall. When we reached the end of the meadow, each of us went into an opposite direction. My uncle went the same direction as the Bigfoot, and I went the other way, in case it double backed on us. But we didn't see the creature after that. We did find a few footprints, but didn't have any plaster to make a mold, so we went back down the mountain. I know what I saw that day, and no one can tell us otherwise. Two friends and I went camping in the San Juan National Forest on 6/1/04. DC and I were from out of state, but JG was a regular camper there. We went 12 miles up the Forest Service Road and picked a campsite. We saw no one else that day, and it was a dead-end road. JG said it was the first time he'd been there alone. We spent the day hiking around and cooking meat over the campfire. We did not see or hear anything unusual that day, other than a partial horse skeleton. At about midnight, we were winding down when we heard 3 two-tone howls to the hill, approximately 1/4 a mile to our north. We knew it was not a coyote, but almost sounded like a person trying to imitate a coyote, because it had a deeper bass tone. About 5 minutes later, we heard the same thing again. Then I heard something like a gunshot in the same area, but there was no sonic crack. It was like something hit a tree, really hard. Both sounds came from the same place as the first set of howls did. We were all standing around the fire, wondering what it was. JG had a shotgun in hand, and we were all starting to get a little edgy. We are all police, former military, so it takes a lot to get any of us edgy. We all have camping experience, and none of us have ever experienced anything like this before. About 5 minutes later, directly to our west was a very loud two-tone howl, approximately 100 yards away. It howled again, and it was closer, so it was closing in on us. DC and I drew our pistols and flashlights, and all of us focused on the logging road that if they would have to cross to get to us. There was a bright full moon, so the open areas were well illuminated. It howled one more two-tone howl before stopping at what we estimated to be 50 yards away, in the woodline. It seemed like it covered at least 50 yards, going through the woods while howling 3 times. Whatever it was big and loud. There was a lot more bass to the howls than a dog or coyote or a wolf. Each time it howled, it was a two-tone, in a series of 3, and it seemed unemotional or even intelligent. About a minute later, another series of 3 two-toned howls came from the hill to the south, approximately a quarter mile away. It seemed to be answering the one hiding in the tree line in front of us. Then the one in the tree line let out 3 more of the same howls. Let me stress again, this thing was loud. We were all pretty shaken. We felt that we had aroused at least 3 big things that were communicating amongst themselves and closing in on us. We were all facing out from a dying fire with weapons and flashlights drawn. We didn't know if we were being studied or they were getting in position for an attack. We decided to leave. After some debate, we decided to pack the trucks while one of us took turns watching with a flashlight and gun. A few moments later, we were packed and headed down the mountain to the main road. We did not see or hear anything while packing or leaving. When we got to the road, we stopped to unload our guns and stow them legally in the trucks. There was one house close to the road, and after a while, the dogs started to bark. I joked to JG that they were coming after us. Just then, we heard another set of howls about a mile back the road we had just come down. Whatever it was had followed us, and we left immediately. We were not sure what it was that night, but after talking about the incidents quite a bit, we think we had a Bigfoot encounter. It was a remote, wooded mountain location with a large lake over the hill. There were at least 3 intelligent beings communicating that sounded loud and very large. We had been leaving our scent all around and had been cooking meat all day. No person would be crazy enough to risk getting shot playing a prank on us. The howls were very eerie, to say the least. Like I said, they were all like the first 2 tones of a wolf howl, but much more bass. There was no trailing off like a dog, coyote, or wolf howl would do, just 2 tones. Each two-tone howl was in a series of 3 howls that took approximately 6 seconds per series. The only thing missing from the encounter was the lack of the famous Bigfoot stench. There was no wind, so maybe the thing in the tree line was far enough away for it not to reach us. We are not out to hoax anyone. We hope none of our colleagues find out, so our day-to-day judgment is not questioned or even ridiculed. I grew up in Boulder County. My parents quit farming in Northeast and moved to Longmont in 1960. During the summer, we would go up to Big Thompson Canyon or the St. Vrain to camp and picnic. In the summer of 1964, we were picnicking along the St. Vrain stream. We had started a campfire. You could do that then. And while I was looking for wood, I felt like I was being stared at. I looked up, and at the top of a sheer rock wall, about 30 feet up, I saw him. I could see him like yesterday. He was looking at me, and as soon as I saw him, he turned and left. He was very large, probably 8 feet tall, and had long graying hair. His face was darker and did almost look human. No one believed me, of course, but I can still see his eyes looking at me before he turned, so I have always believed in their existence. I was driving south Down from the mountain, on my regular route, I had my high beams on because it's dark in that area. It's very rural when all of a sudden, a large upright dark figure stepped out into the road. I stopped and watched it cross the road in 3 steps. This thing was so tall that it stood at least 1.5 feet above the rack on the roof of my Jeep Grand Cherokee. The legs were long, and it bent at the knee like a human. All I seen was the side profile of it. It was very tall, and from what I could see, the head was large and long. The shoulder span was very wide too. The side profile of the face was flat. It very quickly in 3 steps crossed the road. It's a wide 2-lane road. After it crossed, I drove forward a little and tried to see where it went, but I couldn't see it anymore. This thing was frightening. I have been looking for it every time I'm on my route, but had not seen it again. On my other route, which is on a county road, 306, about a 10-minute drive from this incident, 2 days later, there was a very strange, strong smell in the area, around 3 a.m. The smell was a very strong, sweet, burning rubber smell. I can't describe it. I never smelled anything like it before. I smelt this for 2 days straight in this area, and then it was gone. This incident occurred in Chaffee County, Colorado, in an area known as Middle Fork, about 14 to 17 miles west of Salida, off of Highway 50. My friend had an elk tag for that area, but I did not draw, so I was just along for the ride. My friend took a stroll up a very high ridge as I stayed in the bottom, walking along the creek that split the saddle. As I made my way down the creek, I noticed a strange single track in a patch of snow. The track was old as the snow was melting away its clarity, but it strongly resembled that of a human print. It was extremely large, 16 inches long, 7 inches wide. I must have studied the track for an hour, trying to make it out, but it was so very unclear. I did not see another track in the immediate area, but I decided to show it to my friend anyway, even though I started believing that it was just an act of nature. My friend was intrigued by the track, as he found more characteristics in the print than I did. He pointed out the toes, which were very hard to see, but when you looked hard, they were there. They seemed to go straight across the top of the foot, in a straight line, but only 3 were visible. We then chatted about the track for a while, and making excuses for what else it could be. We then decided to head back down. We walked down the creek a little farther when we saw something we could not believe. About 100 yards from the original track were about 6 or 7 additional tracks in snow and mud. These tracks were in much better condition. They had the same dimensions of the first track and appeared to be just as old. They were in a shaded area, so they were somewhat preserved. Like the first track, they only showed 3 toes, but one track showed 4, and one showed 5. The only explanation I had for the tracks being so far apart was whatever made the tracks must have used the rocks along the creek to walk on.